Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Lace McCartney, and I'm actually the Indiana SARE State Coordinator. SARE stands for Sustainable Ag Research and Education. I'm glad you're here. And we're so happy to have Skylar Cantola with us today. I want you to see right now we have on the screen the civil rights posters just to make sure we're letting everyone know that we want to be in accordance and have injustice for all. So I'm sharing that. And at the end of our talk today with Skylar, there will be an evaluation. If you don't mind filling that out, that'd be very helpful to us to let us know if what you've thought about this and for future programming. So we're so glad that you're here. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And then while Skylar is getting ready for her presentation, I'm going to introduce her. Skye Ashton Cantola, and she likes to use the pronouns she or they, is currently working as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Coordinator in Purdue Extension and the Office of Multicultural Programs in the College of Agriculture at Purdue University. In their role at Purdue, they established and continue to facilitate the Becoming White Allies and Accomplices talking circle to engage other white people in racial justice work. Skye co-founded and co-leads Indiana Disability Justice since 2018 and previously served as the program director at the Multicultural Efforts to End Sexual Assault. And that's MESA, the acronym. She served as the communications director at Pedagogy and Theater of the Oppressed, Incorporated, PTO, from 2015 to 2021, and helped establish and continue leading the Transformative Justice Action Group at PTO. In her free time, she enjoys compassionately disrupting complacency, doing positive dog training, studying and intervening in white identity extremism, and caring for the earth. That's awesome. It's so nice to have you here, Skylar. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks. Yes, it's very difficult to find people with similar hobbies to me. All right, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed getting to attend the last two workshops that y'all had, and I'm excited to be here with y'all today. I guess I'll start just by saying that, please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat or comments. I will try to make sure I stop to see if folks have questions, but you're welcome to just put them in any time that you have them. I am also very open about being a queer and trans person with disabilities because a lot of my work has been focused in those communities. Like Lace mentioned, I also have done some racial justice work as a white person. So we have an hour today, and this is kind of the outline I have for us today. So I want to just give a little bit additional context around equity and inclusion based on some of the things that I think haven't been covered already in the other two webinars. I want to give some examples of how to learn about and engage with respectful language. And then most of the slides will be related to addressing implicit bias and actually applying diversity, equity, and inclusion principles into practice and extension. And then I have a slide with some additional resources that you will be able to, I'll make sure that you get the PowerPoint and the slides and whatever. Okay, so, this first slide, I just want to give like a quick overview of some of the values that can guide your efforts in equity and inclusion. So these are kind of the top 5 things that I think are helpful and important to consider. So first off, that everyone is learning. There's no wrong place to begin learning. I think sometimes people feel so overwhelmed as they realize all the things that they don't know that it can be overwhelming and easy to just give up. But if we understand that anything that we do is an ongoing effort in learning, I think it can kind of reduce some of the pressure that people put on themselves. We also, at least in the US, have a lot of perfectionist culture. I myself have a really hard time not being a perfectionist, but it's important to realize that equity and inclusion is not just an outcome, it's a process. And really, the goal should be growing. It's not that there is somehow, there's no end outcome of being somehow a perfect ally to a different community or somehow being a perfect identity of some kind. It's really just about being willing to engage with the things you don't know and build on the things that you do and developing those skills. A lot of times there's an excessive focus on outcomes and not enough focus on the process. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more in future slides. But basically, how we go about our work impacts the outcomes of that work. So if I'm trying to, whenever I do like disability justice work, if I force everyone to contribute equally or consider themselves to be failing, if I don't take into account the things that people are going through, or if they're having health complications, that creates a lot of stress and inequity in the ways that people can contribute to a project, and it ultimately results in less great outcomes if people, if we don't consider the ways being a human impacts our ability to collaborate and work on things. Everyone makes mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes. Sometimes we also cause harm. And while that's unfortunate, it's not fair to assume that people can never make mistakes or never cause harm. And not giving people the dignity of risk prevents us from actually growing. So the very end, we're going to talk about the art of apologizing whenever you do make mistakes or cause harm, to try to figure out how to respond to those situations. And then lastly, I've had a lot of people in classes think that they can't contribute to a conversation if they're not part of that community. But a lot of our life experiences will naturally help you to engage across areas of difference. If you've ever had a conflict with a family member, you've probably learned something about conflict resolution, even if it wasn't necessarily a fun or a good experience. Sorry, okay, I put on the transcript because I use transcripts, but then I realized it was like distracting me. Okay, so I realize this is a lot. We're not going to go through every one of these items, but I wanted to just introduce people to the idea of structural inequity. So structural inequity means when there is some policy or practice built into an institution that disparately impacts one group, sometimes to the advantage of another. So if we understand structural inequity is a kind of institutional harm, it means that as individuals, none of us have the ability to change an entire institution alone, but we do have opportunities to be educated about the historical context of the structural inequity, and then opportunities to respond in our own lives in ways that better support people. So just as a quick intro, typically people will kind of categorize people as privileged or marginalized. And if you don't really know a lot about the historical context, it can be really confusing why anyone would do that. An example of this is whenever white people think that white people can experience racism. But racism is a combination of structural power and bias. So because of historical reasons and current structural infrastructure, white people overwhelmingly have access to that kind of structural power that people of color don't as a population or a community. And so when we talk about white people being privileged, it doesn't mean that the person has had an easy life based on their race. It just means that their race has not made their life harder. And so a lot of times whenever we look at the marginalized group, this is kind of an important thing or a salient thing to understand, because oftentimes other kinds of harm are rooted in that particularly marginalized community. So this is why, for example, when we're talking about racism, people will often talk about racism in the US as rooted in anti-Blackness because of the history of Black people in this country, and understanding that even though other people of color also experience racism, and it's not really fair to try to find a way to measure that across different races, it is true that a lot of the racism that other people of color experience is actually rooted in that anti-Blackness. Just to give another quick example, whenever we talk about socioeconomic status, A lot of times folks who have experienced wealth their entire life, they have access to intergenerational wealth, they often can own land, or they lack debt or easily pay off debt. Those folks are often the most financially and economically privileged. And then, of course, the most marginalized are folks who grew up in poverty, who eventually experience long-term poverty, often don't have any kind of land ownership, and may have a really expensive high-interest debt like credit cards or payday loans. And then, of course, like on the far right, we can look at different, the language we can use to identify these different experiences like racism, classism, xenophobia, or sizeism. Do folks have any questions about the first section or the first two slides? I can't see people's faces, but I'm just gonna assume not.
I don't have a question, Skylar, but I do have a comment. I had never heard that racism was basically anti-Blackness. So this is actually very new information to me. I don't know if other people have heard that. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, this is also why there's many communities use the acronym BIPOC, B-I-P-O-C. So it stands for Black, Indigenous, and Other People of Color. And that phrasing is really specifically intended to draw attention to the fact that Black and Indigenous folks have a very particular and particularly egregious history in the country. So this slide can be like multiple university classes. So this is a very short introduction. I will send a link to a really quick 5-minute video that does a good job of kind of summarizing that idea. Okay, so a couple of language examples. So I'm trying to pull examples from a variety of different communities. And so I wanted to start by just kind of looking at the idea of race, ethnicity, and nationality. I'm going to preface this by saying that these are very neatly organized little boxes, and that is not how identities work. So this is intended to be an example, and understanding that for some people, these different identities may overlap. Some people, for example, might consider African American their racial identity. But these are kind of general ideas that are applicable, at least in the US. So in the US, people are generally racially categorized as Asian, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Middle Eastern or North African, or white. In the US, though, in particular, oftentimes Latinx and Middle Eastern or North African people are categorized in the government's perspective as white. And we don't have time to go through this, but the reason for that is largely because historically, whenever the government has agreed to address racial inequity, it has been to the benefit of the government to classify some people who do not have access to white privilege as white to reduce the amount of support or resources that community can access. So this racial categories, I'm kind of listing from a community focus instead of just strictly a legal or governmental focus. And then, of course, there are a lot of different ethnicities in the world. These could be things like Jewish, Slavic, Arab. Han is a really common ethnicity in China. Kurdish is a really common ethnicity in the Middle East and Central Asia. And Bantu is a really common ethnicity in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And then, of course, nationalities have more to do with the countries of origin. But of course, these, like I said, can overlap, right? Somebody might consider themselves ethnically German or German in their nationality. And so there is like a lot of overlap. And then another example I just wanted to give, because I think it illustrates kind of the complex nature or the complicated levels of respect or disrespect around gender and sexuality. So on the left, we have some different respectful words, and on the right, there's different disrespectful ones. And I've actually outlined like, why are they disrespectful? So a more respectful way would be to say lesbian or same gender loving. SGL is a more common phrase in communities of color. And then obviously dyke is considered a slur. And homosexual is just kind of dated. Like, it's not like, I don't think most people would get offended if you use the word homosexual, but it's just kind of weird. It's like, I'm not going to think of a good example off the top of my head because it's been a long day. I'm sorry. Similarly, gay or same gender loving, and then obviously faggot is a slur, and again, homosexual is dated. A lot of people have a lot of difficulty understanding when referring to someone as queer is respectful or not. Like any identity, I think it's generally the most respectful to refer to people how they refer to themselves. So if someone likes being referred to as a queer person and they're comfortable being called a queer person, then that's great. If they're not, then it's important to respect that. I would generally say that there is a distinction between using queer as an adjective and a noun. So if you refer to someone as a queer person, which is an adjective use of queer, that's generally considered respectful. If you use queer as a noun, like you say that queer or a queer over there, that's a slur. Please don't do that. For trans folks, people might say trans person or transgender person. You've probably heard at least some of the disrespectful words. So transvestite historically was a diagnosis given to people to suggest that being trans was inherently a mental illness. So it's not just dated, but it's also a pathological word. And most people now would probably consider that a slur as well. Transsexual is similarly dated. It was also used as a medical diagnosis. And some people in the trans community, particularly older folks, consider transsexual to refer just to people who have or are medically transitioning. But for a lot of reasons, a lot of younger folks don't really like that distinction. And then hopefully you know that tranny is a slur, so please don't use that. And then intersex refers to people whose body is not easily categorized as male or female. Please use the word intersex as kind of a general category. Hermaphrodite is incredibly inaccurate because it's one type of intersex condition. It's also a very medical perspective, and many people see it as disrespectful because of the inaccuracy of it. And then lastly, asexual refers to like folks who don't experience sexual attraction to other people. And there's a wide range of ways that people might experience that. But it's important not to conflate asexuality with celibacy. Celibacy does not comment on whether someone experiences sexual attraction in some way. It just means that there's a deliberate effort not to have sex in some way. Asexual typically refers to when like the actual person's ability to experience sexual attraction. So they're not the same thing. And a lot of asexual people would see it as disrespectful to conflate asexuality with celibacy. Okay, so before we go to the next section, I just want to mention, right, like I'm not expecting you, if this information is really new, it's not necessarily helpful to memorize all the words and the definitions. Instead, it's really using respectful language is an effort in empathy and deeply listening. Of course, like it's helpful to also take the time to stay updated as language changes because language is cultural and so it changes with cultural changes. But you know, it's okay if you don't know what a word means or if you need to ask somebody. It's really just, like I said, about listening and reflecting the language that people use for themselves. Okay, do people have any questions about language before we go to the applied section? Okay. All right. Okay, sorry, I put these out of order. Let's start here. Okay, so I was asked to kind of help us think through how to address implicit bias and then how to really apply a lot of the information that's been given in this webinar series. And so I want to start off by looking at implicit bias through a lens of disability, because I often find it's like the easiest for people to pinpoint because ableism is so ingrained in American culture. I think in particular because we have such a strong value of profit and productivity. So to think through internalized ableism, we can kind of think through some of these questions. So when you see somebody who has a disability, do you ever feel pity, disgust, or fear? Sometimes, you know, I see this happen a lot with like people being scared of someone who has like some kind of facial disability, or pity if they see people with like wheelchairs or other kinds of mobility devices. I know y'all can't see me, but I actually am a cane user, and it's a really weird experience because as a younger person, I'm sorry, I live at a relatively busy intersection, even though I live in the middle of nowhere. So there's like always ambulances. Okay, as a cane user, and especially as a young person, I will notice either by the way people look at me or sometimes the conversations I've had that people have this like intense level of pity for me because I'm a young person who uses a cane. And it's really weird because to me, like having a cane actually like significantly increases my quality of life. Like I'm really happy to have a cane and I appreciate having that assistive device. But other people see it as like, oh, I bet you wish that you didn't have to use a cane. And so isn't that really sad for you? And to me, it's like, well, it's improved my quality of life. So like, I don't feel bad about myself. Like I'm happy to have this. Similarly, like, do you judge yourself or others when you take time to rest and aren't working? A lot of people with disabilities, because there is such a stark contrast to our ability or the ways that we engage with different kinds of work, there is a lot of people with disabilities who really value rest and kind of like a better work-life balance, often because we don't have a choice, right? Like I take medications like 6 or 7 times a day. And so if I don't slow down and give myself extra time to pack everything I need whenever I have to physically go to work, I'm going to have a very unfortunate day and I'm not going to get a lot done. So I have to make the time to actually take care of myself. And so in some ways, because I've had to practice that a lot, I feel like I've made a little bit of progress on not like judging myself so much whenever I rest. Similarly, do you ever feel ashamed taking care of yourself? I think these kinds of two things are really common for people. If you're just in the workforce, like a lot of us kind of get trained, like if you're not doing something productive for the sake of a profit, you're not working. So it's like one of the things I try to do is whenever I take time off, I do not say that I did nothing, because I did a lot of stuff. I just wasn't doing it for profit. I was doing it for fun or to take care of myself or something. And then this last bullet point is really focusing on what we talked about earlier, prioritizing the process over just the outcomes. So whenever you collaborate on a project, you actually start by establishing boundaries, needs, and strengths. So, you know, if you have a project that's going to require a lot of decisions, do you preemptively talk about how are we going to make those decisions? How does each person get to contribute to the decision making? And if there is disagreement, how is that decision going to be settled? Do people actually get the opportunity to talk about what they can and can't do? So, you know, in the Indiana Disability Justice, all of the leadership have different disabilities. And so, for example, one of the things that we have had is 2 of our leaders are wheelchair users and they both live in Muncie. So every time our leadership group gets together, the rest of us are not wheelchair users. So we all drive to Muncie because even though it's technically not equal because we all didn't have to drive, it is equitable because the expense of one of the wheelchair users and having to travel would take about $500 for them just to get to Indianapolis. Sorry, I just realized y'all are all over the place. So Muncie is like this tiny town in Indiana that's like 2 hours away from where I live. And Indianapolis is kind of at the center of the state. Anyway, so right, like it's technically equal if we all have to drive, but it's not equitable because the amount of effort each of us would have to put into a particular task is really different. And so, for example, right, like as a chronically ill person, I'm not functional at like 8 or 9 a.m. It's really hard for me to do things then. And so one aspect of having an equitable project might be, when do you all work the best? How can we find a time to meet or collaborate whenever we all feel the best that we do? Or, you know, is there something that's really difficult for you to do that you would like somebody else to take on? Does that make sense? Do people have questions about those kinds of like questions you can ask yourself? Okay, cool. Okay, so when we actually talk about like addressing implicit bias, I think, of course, it's important to remember that we develop implicit bias because we live in a community context where a lot of cultural norms can be based on stereotypes or misunderstood history or community norms. Maybe a good example of this is that there's still a really pervasive idea that LGBTQ folks are all hypersexual and have a lot of sex and get lots of STDs and all this kind of stuff. And it's important, while that's not accurate, like none of that's accurate, it's important to understand, okay, well, where did that come from? It largely originated at least in its modern manifestation. You could say that it originated during the 70s and 80s, right before and during the AIDS crisis, because at the time there was a really big push in the gay liberation movement to destigmatize different kinds of healthy sexuality, like open communication about sex, not being required to be married to have sex if that's what you prefer, or if that's what works for you. But because the culture the mainstream, mostly heteronormative culture did not value the same things, that culture then assessed the different cultural norms and values that LGBTQ folks had through their own lens, and therefore translated this real phenomenon as, well, all gay people are just really promiscuous and get lots of diseases. And so even though maybe your parents didn't explicitly tell you those things, like I know mine didn't, but it was still a very apparent idea that I was raised with. Actually, whenever I grew up in Southern Baptism, so it was like a very evangelical and conservative culture. Whenever I came out to my parents when I was like 18, my mom my entire life had told me, like, don't have sex before you're married, and like that was it. And whenever I came out to her, she was like, okay, well, just be safe. And that was like her very Southern way of saying, well, I know you're about to have sex with a lot of people, so please don't get any diseases, right? So she didn't have to say exactly what she was meaning, but what she meant was based on this implicit bias rooted in a cultural norm that she was not fully aware of. So in thinking through addressing implicit bias, of course, like the best thing is just prevention, like taking time to learn about different communities, exposing yourself to different cultures. One thing, whenever you're thinking about how to learn more about a community, it can be valuable to think about what the space is for. So I would, for example, not recommend going to like a support group for a community that you're not a part of. Like I led a non-clinical trans support group for a long time. And I would sometimes have like cis straight people come who just were curious to see what trans people did together, which is very voyeuristic, and it's not an appropriate use of the space. But if you're noticing there's an event that's open to everyone, or is specifically educational or social in nature, those are probably good events to attend just to kind of get familiar with the community. I know for a lot of people, it feels really terrifying to try to go to like a new community space or interact with people in a community that you have not had a lot of exposure to. And I think a lot of times that is rooted in the fear of making mistakes or offending people or causing harm. And so one way I recommend to navigate that is to go attend things that don't really require you to have direct interaction. So for example, like webinars, YouTube channels, TikTok, y'all, I know TikTok is terrible for data reasons, but like you will learn so much from the kids about so many communities. And so like, just taking time, even if it's just like one-way interactions, and then eventually as you feel more familiar and you feel like, oh, I actually know how to like engage in respectful communication with folks in this community, maybe you can go to community events or spaces, like even if you're not part of a university, if you're near any kind of university that has cultural centers, a lot of times they'll have open events for people to attend that just allow you to be exposed to different communities that you may not have had opportunities to interact with before. So whenever you notice that you are potentially one way to notice if you are accidentally operating from an implicit bias is just to start paying attention to your reactions. Do you find yourself being surprised if you have a Black colleague as a faculty? Or, do you find it surprising whenever you see a queer trans person in a medical office? Maybe a more specific example is like whenever trans men, who are people who are usually assigned female at birth, have to go get reproductive care, right? Like you may think you're in an OBGYN and you might be confused, like, why is this man here, right? But so like that's an implicit bias, assuming that men can also have vaginas. Okay. Okay, do you tell people no when other alternatives are possible? This is really important because very frequently when someone asks you to help them with something, sometimes whenever we give people less space or less grace, it is a good indication that we are devaluing a group. It's not always the case, but for example, if a person with disabilities is attending a class that you have and they say, hey, can you please send me the PowerPoint in advance so I can pull it up on my device so that I can see it better? I've met faculty who just will not do it because they're worried about copyright issues or like their intellectual property, which is like, I understand the concern, but at some point it's like, this person literally needs us to access this. And at the point that it starts causing harm or creating inaccessibility, like it's really important to just at least reevaluate, why are you saying no? And what is the impact that you're having on someone if you're not just willing to try to accommodate them? I highly recommend slowing down for everybody. It is a really great life practice. It just helps you be more intentional in general. And then as you've noticed, the implicit bias, actually do something. So, I think about part of this to me is like not making assumptions, right? So again, sorry, university is on my mind because students are about to have their finals. But I've met faculty who have like attendance policies that are very inflexible. And I've had students reach out and say, hey, I have a funeral or a wedding or, whatever other thing that's like important to them. Am I going to be counted absent? And I'm like, no, that's an important thing for you. Like, I support you taking care of yourself or taking care of your family or whatever else. And then if I've had instances where students are like absent for a really long time, instead of being like, you're losing a letter grade because you weren't attending every day, I want to reach out and say, how are you doing? Do you need support? How can I help you? Again, remembering that learning is a continual process. And lastly, asking for feedback early and often. And this is incredibly important because as someone with a background in violence prevention, I think one of the most important things that is not talked about is the idea of accountability. And I don't mean getting people in trouble or reprimanded. I mean, having the opportunity to have difficult conversations so people can feel heard and supported in healing when harm has occurred. And also to make sure that people, whether they have caused harm or experienced harm, are able to heal from that experience. Okay, so, okay, I forgot this because it wasn't in order, but I'm going to go back just briefly to this disability example. So I want people to kind of understand whenever we talk about implicit bias or structural inequity, it's really easy to just avoid these kinds of topics or think that it's modular instead of universal. So modular equity and inclusion is like, okay, we have an entire class or let's say an entire collaborative project, like an extension program. And the entire program is around some kind of life skills development. And in 1 week, one session, there's an equity and inclusion section. That's like a modular educational model. A universal model would say equity and inclusion is important to every segment of this educational curriculum. And so that information needs to be included throughout the entire curriculum. So anyway, so what I was trying to say is that it's easy to assume that equity and inclusion is like an afterthought or something that's not very important. But it really comes down to both conveying respect to people and also trying to alleviate some of the ways that society makes it harder for marginalized folks to move through the world. So if we look at a disability example, let's pretend the world is kind of flipped around and most of the people in the world have disabilities. So if you are functioning the way you do now, what would it look like to move through the world knowing that nobody notices the challenges that you experience and nobody really cares to change it? So I wanted to give 3 different examples of what this might look like. So for a mobility disability example, what if most people in the world were wheelchair users, and every time you attended a meeting, you either have to find your own chair, stand the entire time, or ask the meeting host to help you find a chair? Knowing, of course, that like if you've ever done programming, which probably most of y'all have if you're in extension, oftentimes the actual program implementation is really hectic. The host may not feel like they have time to like help you, or they may just be like, all right, that's not my job. That's a good example of like a no response when there doesn't need to be one, right? That would be really disheartening to have to move through the world and know that no matter where you go, like there is not going to be a place for you to feel like your body is supported in that space. Similarly, around being autistic or neurodivergent, imagine like in a work setting that every time you spoke to somebody, they would look startled or offended, but nobody explains to you what's wrong. Over time, people start to ignore you and don't invite you to things. So this is really common for a lot of folks who have a hard time picking up on nonverbal or like unspoken social norms. And so you can imagine if you didn't know why people were upset, that would be really upsetting. And it would probably be really helpful for people just to be willing to have a conversation with you openly about whatever's wrong, and not necessarily in the way that it requires the person to change, but just so that they can have a choice in how to navigate. A good example of like a consent model for development. Yes, I'm also autistic. Cool. Okay. Yes, this is actually, so as an autistic person, one of the analogies I sometimes give people is I used to be completely confounded by people wanting to talk about the weather. I was like, is everybody like stupid? I also hate that word, but that's what I was thinking at the time. I was like, we have an app and you can just look, like you can just go outside. And I eventually realized that it was like, I equate it to like, you know, the CAPTCHA things where you have to like enter the thing so it knows you're a human and not a robot. I feel like that's what small talk is like. It's like somebody being like, hey, I'm a human. Are you a human too? And like kind of understanding that that's what was happening helps me be like, okay, it's weird to me to talk about the weather that we're literally standing outside in, but I understand now like the social value of that. And so I am happy to try to practice that with people. What I was going to say a second ago was, so I just wanted to mention that it's really valuable and important, I think, to operate from a consent perspective whenever we're talking about marginalized people navigating systems. So for example, whenever I led a trans group, I would sometimes have like professionalism workshops. What I did not do was tell people, if you're gender nonconforming or if you're trans, you will not find a job, so you need to find a way to pass. But that's frequently what professionalism training is like. It just says, these are the rules, you have to abide by them. So instead, the workshops that I would lead would be like, okay, here are kind of the general expectations of professionalism, you know, varies by field, how people perceive you and everything else. But based on that and your own identity experiences, how do you want to choose to navigate that? And how can I support you in learning how to navigate? So instead of imposing a mainstream idea of what professionalism looks like, people have the ability to make their own informed choices. And then this last example for someone who is deaf or hard of hearing, imagine if the job interviews were all conducted in English and Spanish Creole. Every question has multiple components and no one will write the questions down for you to read along, even though you're allowed to respond in English. So it's like, you know, anyone with like different linguistic backgrounds, you know, it may be really difficult to follow conversations or information if the information is not presented in several formats. Okay, I think I just have a couple more slides, and I am so impressed that we are running on time. Okay, so when you're thinking about like actual programming or collaborative projects, I just want us to kind of have a quick overview of like considerations for doing outreach that is both ethical and effective, and similarly like with collaborative projects. So in terms of outreach, one of the things I hear a lot in both public health and also extension areas is sometimes people will say, well, I've never seen anyone in that category here, so I don't think we have any of those. And in reality, like that might be true, but probably not. Like probably what's happening is that space or that office has a either a negative reputation in the community, or it's just that nobody's really utilized the resource because it historically has not been accessible. And one thing that you'll find is a lot of marginalized communities operate more from word of mouth than they do from like formal information. Like instead of going to the organization's website first, they might ask, hey, I know you went to one of these events. How was that for you? And so it becomes really important whenever you are working with marginalized folks that you realize that that person is likely going to end up talking to other people in their community, and that's going to inform their relationship with the organization. If you don't know where to begin, just start by finding organizations that already exist for that community. You know, like for example, in Indiana, we have the Indiana Minority Health Coalition, and they have a variety of, like they're based out of Indianapolis, but they have lots of site locations across the state. So for example, in my town, we have a community center that is specifically geared towards supporting healthy child development for youth of color and for low-income youth. And it's really cool because they offer a wide variety of things that impact the social determinants of health of young people, like food security, cognitive stimulation, social opportunities, things like that. So you don't necessarily have to know a lot about working with youth or working with people of color or low income folks. You might just reach out to the organization and say, hey, I realize like we haven't done a great job working with this community and we really want to learn. And so we'd like to find out if there are ways that we can support your work or collaborate. That also perfectly leads to this third item, which is that it is often not helpful to reach out to somebody, an organization, and say, hey, do you want to do this thing with us that we've already organized? That doesn't really build trust, and it kind of suggests that your only priority is your own priority instead of that of the actual community. So I generally recommend for people to kind of start more slowly, like attending community events and getting like the vibe of the community space or the organization, letting them know where you work, and then also kind of supporting their own events. So, locally we have like a Pride festival. And so sometimes whenever people are like, I would like to work more with like queer folks locally, they will start off by hosting a booth at the Pride festival just to kind of meet community members and figure out the organizations that exist and stuff like that. And then identifying common goals. So whenever I was doing more, the last 8 years I was doing community-based violence prevention education around Indiana. And so if I go to a community and I'm like, hey, let's talk about sexual assault, most people are not going to want to do that. But if I say, hey, I know that your organization really cares about healthy communities, and I am wondering, since I do a lot of work on healthy families, if there is a way that we could work on something related to healthy communities and healthy families together. So it's sometimes about like kind of adjusting your language based on how it might be best received from the community, or kind of supporting like their goals as well as yours in a more like equitable way. I'm really sorry I have so many cars today. I don't even know. It's not even a holiday. Okay, and then collaboration. So it's really easy for mainstream organizations to see marginalized communities as needing saving or needing help. And it's a very like condescending and also just inaccurate way to view marginalized communities. So if you go into a community and you start working together and you realize like, oh, this community really needs education around healthy, nutritious food and food prep. So if you were, for example, working in Latinx communities, a lot of Latinx communities have a lot of both vertical and horizontal kinship structures. So they may often have, grandparents involved in child raising. There might be lots of like parents who all kind of take care of each other's kids. And so one thing that would be cool, like you already know the need, and then maybe a strength is that as you start working with community members, they're all going to support each other in maintaining these like healthy practices. So it's important to look at both. Okay, I'm glad the cars aren't too loud. Okay. Okay, yes, I think a lot of this just comes down to like being willing to deeply listen, slowing down. One of the things that I think is probably very relatable to a lot of extension folks is being in an extension program that also was grant funded, right? Like I had to meet a lot of like really specific timeline issues, like deadlines and, outcome measurements. And that was very stressful, but I also kind of refused to I didn't want to put the stress of that on my partners. So, one example was we were required to submit all of our educational materials a week in advance to our grantor. And so if I had a community member who reached out and they were like, hey, can we work on this thing in like 3 days? That's not a lot of prep time, but like I want to work with the community. So I'm like, yeah, that's totally cool. Fine, let's do that. Now, if the grantor got upset, that's unfortunate. But I was not going to not work with the community because the grant wanted like this arbitrary like deadline for materials, especially when it wasn't even something that the grantors needed to review. I still to this day have no idea why we had to submit it a week in advance. But I've always tried to make sure that I'm not putting the burden of the bureaucracy on the communities that I'm working with. Okay. Yes. Okay, we're almost done. Okay, so I wanted to kind of introduce people to the idea of transformative justice. So whenever I started talking about accountability, a lot of times, a lot of aspects of American society, especially in professional settings, practice like punitive forms of accountability. And I think that it's a very common thing to buy into because it's really mostly what we're surrounded by, but I want people just to know that there are a lot of other alternatives. Transformative justice or transformative accountability is the idea that harm is a natural aspect of human life, of social interactions, but those moments of harm also have a lot of opportunity for healing and growth for people. And so instead of trying to retaliate to harm with more harm, how instead can we prioritize the healing of both the people who might have caused harm and the person who experienced harm? So this is a very brief overview of this framework. So for example, if we think about the issue of self-care, transformative accountability would suggest that taking care of ourselves and our bodies, because we're people with bodies, is really important in order to be sustainable, to interact with people respectfully. I'm sure you've had the experience when you're really tired, it's a lot harder to have patience. And so just being willing to support people in taking care of themselves or supporting each other, even in professional settings, can go a really long way to creating a healthier work environment. An example of this is when I've had people that I supervise. One of the things I tell them at the very beginning of our work together is I say, I want you to feel like you can take care of yourself when you need. So you don't need to ask me permission to use the restroom, to take a phone call. I'm going to operate with a level of trust. And if we have any issues, we can talk about that as that happens. But I want to support you and doing the things you need to take care of yourself. We've talked a lot about this issue of morality. So instead of saying this person is good or this person is bad, if we instead said this person caused harm or this person supported healing, that might be a better way to say that, because it doesn't ascribe an individual's single action or behavior to their morality as a person generally. And I think it's also just a lot more effective in helping people get to a place where they're interested in being accountable in a non-punitive way. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead. Okay. Cool. Thank you. You're all very kind. Okay, so the last like topic I have for us today is just thinking through apologizing. This is really important, like I said, because practicing accountability is so important for healthy relationships and healthy work environments. I'm sure you have experienced something where somebody hurt your feelings or was really offensive and they responded really poorly, and that sticks in your mind. Like, it's really hard to forget or move through those situations and not continue to just see the person for that one action that they did. And so the best way to just prevent having to experiencing harm, causing harm, or having to apologize in the first place is to create opportunities for people to give feedback early and often. You know, one of the things I've done is I'm the lead for the DEI strategic plan for our extension office at Purdue. And whenever I joined this office, I actually created like a survey that anybody is welcome to send feedback to me, like about any of my work. You know, I don't have to know who it is. Of course, they have my email if they just want to talk to me. But I want people to feel like there is a way for them to reach me that doesn't make them feel like, you know, there's going to be some kind of retaliation or something. And also, if you've ever had an experience where something escalated really quickly in a work environment, it's often because somebody doesn't feel like they have an outlet. So even just like if you're worried from a legal perspective, like it can be really helpful to just create an environment where people are willing and feel safe in talking through conflict or issues or, you know, anything like that. I will also, to give just a brief example, like I lead, you know, they mentioned like I lead the Becoming White Allies and Accomplices talking circle at Purdue in the College of Agriculture. And one of the things that I made very clear since the beginning is like, people can ask me or say anything related to race or racism, and I will never report them. Like, I want people to know in that group that I aspire to be fully destigmatizing. And if we don't have these really messy and complicated conversations, it just allows more harm to happen. Also, I don't know, maybe other people don't feel this way, but I like genuinely enjoy the ways that people like learn things and their curiosity and confusion. And so that has also opened up a lot of like really interesting conversations that I never thought I would have. It's just like, it's really good. Okay, so if somebody either brings it to your attention or you realize that you have caused harm or made some kind of mistake, it's really important to just start with "I'm sorry." I know that sounds like very intuitive, but if you actually think through it, there's very frequently where people instead of saying "I'm sorry," they just immediately go to what they intended. So instead of like, okay, so I'll use a really silly example, right? Like somebody steps on your foot. And instead of being like, "Oh, I'm really sorry, I'll pay better attention where I'm going next time," they just either ignore you or they say, "You were in my way." or even like, "I didn't notice you there," right? Like all of those things are like either explanations or deflections from the incident that happened. So just start with "I'm sorry" or "I apologize," and then try to make sure that you're prioritizing the impact over the intent. So making sure that, you know, starting with "I'm sorry" means that you are recognizing that what you did caused harm. And that in and of itself is really important, and it allows you to prioritize the impact over the intent. I actually encourage people, if somebody has the courage to tell you that they are offended or hurt, I would think of it as like a gift that they are invested enough in your relationship that they want to support you in growing, and also that they felt courageous enough to advocate for themselves. If you've ever been in a situation where you felt like you couldn't advocate for yourself, you know, like how disheartening that is, to feel like you have no way to be like, no, I am a human, and it would be really great if you treated me like another person. I don't know if any of y'all are Parks and Recreation fans. It's a TV show. I am obsessed with it because I'm not from Indiana, and I have to tell you, it is so accurate. Like, it is exactly what Indiana is like. Anyway, the protagonist is talking about like going through town halls and how angry people get at town halls. And she says, what I hear when I'm being yelled at is people caring loudly. I do not want you to be yelled at. I do not encourage you yelling at people, but I think the sentiment of like when people take the time to be like, that was really hurtful, that is people showing that they actually care about themselves and the relationship with you and your growth. It's okay to explain the intent if you want to explain it, but don't allow it to become an excuse. Also know that especially if it's rooted in some type of marginalization, the person probably knows why. Like, I can't tell you how many times I have attempted to use a restroom and somebody has tried to stop me or harass me or said something weird, or just like tried to like stop me from going into a restroom they think I don't belong in. And I've experienced that so many times that I know all the reasons why people do that. They think they're not sure if I know where I am, or they are worried that I'm going to scare other people in the restroom, or they're scared of me, or whatever, right? Like, they can, and then sometimes also it's like, oh, I thought you were a man, or I thought you were a woman. And so I usually am too scared to like talk to people when that happens, because I've had a lot of really weird experiences with restrooms. But this one time I was actually at a queer cafe in Texas, and this person like tried to stop me from going into a women's restroom, and I turned around and she like finally saw me and was like really horrified. And I was like, you know, that actually happens to me a lot, and it would be really nice if you didn't assume why people are choosing a restroom. And you know, like, I'm a very chill person. Like, I wasn't trying to make her feel bad. I was just like, I really want you to know, like, what you just did is something I experienced like a lot, and it's unfortunate. Like, it's really depressing that happens so much. It's really helpful if you can explain what you want to do to change or learn. So this might be, let me see, do I have an example? Oh yeah, I totally have an example. Okay. And then if you need to, you can ask the person if they're willing to explain further, if you're not sure why they're upset, or even ask them if they could suggest resources so you can continue learning. And so I wanted to give just a quick example of what this might look like. So person one says, what are you in terms of someone's race or ethnicity? This is something that I have seen friends of color experience a lot. And then the person of color says, I'm a person, and it's really disrespectful to ask people what they are. So I've never heard of this happening this way, but it would be great if the person said, oh, I'm really sorry. I was just curious, but I understand that asking what someone is can be hurtful since they're a person and not a thing. And then the person of color might say, thanks, I appreciate you being willing to listen. It's also just not a very good idea to ask people what their race or ethnicity is. It's not really important to someone else, and it can feel really invasive. And so then the first person says, okay, that makes sense. Do you have any recommendations of where I could learn more about how to be respectful to people of different races? And the person two might be like, that's not my job. I don't have time for that, which is also fine, right? It's not ultimately their responsibility to educate you, but they might be willing to be a resource. And if not, you can take some time to find other resources that will help you learn. And towards that end, I have a list of different resources that are, the first two are actually extension DEI resources that you may not know about. And then there's several others that are focused on specific communities. So there's a few different resources related to racial justice, Indiana disability justice, which I know I'm biased, but it's so good, y'all. Like, there's so many cool resources. GLSEN is kind of a dated name, but it's called the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, but they specifically have resources for educators. So you might find that helpful. They have like toolkits and stuff. National Immigration Law Center and the Association to Advance Fat Acceptance. There's like lots of other different resources, but this might just give you like a good starting place. And oh my gosh, we're exactly on time.